Right now, children today actually spend less time outdoors than maximum security prison.
Wait, seriously? Maximum security.
Yeah, it is a completely wild statistic to try and wrap your head around. And teenagers, they are currently consuming up to 9 hours of screen media every single day.
9 hours? I mean, that is essentially a full-time job, plus overtime.
Exactly. And if you measure that against the time they spend reading an actual book, screens are outweighing reading by a ratio of almost 10 to 1.
It is a staggering reality. Especially when you really stop and think about the neurological implication of that kind of sheer volume.
It is chilling on it. So welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you are probably the kind of person who looks around at the culture, sees those kinds of statistics, and wants to understand the actual currents moving beneath the surface.
Right. You want to cut through all the information overload.
Exactly. And today we have a really fascinating mission. We are examining a deeply provocative YouTube video essay. It's by a creator named Echo Chamberlain, and the title of the piece is Imagination is Done.
And just to set the stage, we aren't just looking at screen time here or, doing the whole kids these days complaining thing.
Oh, no, far from it.
What's fascinating here is that the author is positing a profound structural psychological shift. Chamberlain's central thesis is that we aren't simply changing how we consume media.
Right.
The argument is that the fundamental human capacity for imagination, like the biological and psychological ability to envision things that are not immediately present, is actively eroding. We are fundamentally altering our relationship with the very concept of fiction.
Yeah, it's not just a habit change, it's a collapse of a specific cognitive muscle. And to really understand this proposed death of imagination, we first have to look at the environment where this erosion begins, right? The modern screen.
Absolutely. And Chamberlain makes this incredibly sharp distinction right out of the gate between two concepts we almost always conflate in modern society. We use them interchangeably, but they are practically opposite.
I know exactly what you're going to say. Imagination and engagement.
Yes. Those two words. This is the foundational crux of the entire argument. I mean, we see a teenager or a child staring intently at an iPad, completely locked in, unblinking, and we assume their mind is incredibly active.
Right. We think, wow, they are so engaged. Their imagination must be firing on all cylinders.
Exactly. But Chamberlain points out that early, constant exposure to screen fundamentally alters the mechanics of how stimulation arrives at the brain.
Okay, walk me through that, because that sounds like a mechanical issue with the brain itself.
It absolutely is. Think about the brain as a prediction and generation engine. For thousands of years, to experience a rich visual or auditory world that wasn't physically in front of you, your brain had to generate it from the inside out.
Like when reading a book.
Right. You read a sentence describing a dragon or a forest, and your brain's neural networks have to actively fire to paint the colors, construct the scale, and synthesize the sound. It requires heavy cognitive lifting.
But with screens.
But through a high-definition screen, stimulation arrives pre-made. You are handed the color, the noise, the pacing, and the emotional musical cues on a silver platter.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it's like the difference between giving a kid a giant disorganized box of Lego bricks versus handing them a high-end battery-operated wind-up toy.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. The wind-up toy is incredibly engaging. It flashes lights, it does backflips, it makes siren noises. You are totally locked in watching it go. But the toy is doing 100% of the work. You just sit back. The Lego bricks, on the other hand, are just, plastic. To make them interesting, you have to build the toy, envision its purpose, and actively narrate its existence in your mind.
Exactly. You provide the energy.
So are screens basically acting as a motorized wheelchair for the brain? Like, our imaginative muscles just atrophy because the algorithm is doing all the heavy lifting?
That is exactly the mechanism at play. In neuroscience, there's a concept involving the default mode network. It's the part of the brain that becomes highly active when you are daydreaming, envisioning the future, or engaging in unstructured thought.
Oh, wow. So it's a specific biological network?
Yes. And it requires moments of low external input, essentially boredom or quiet to activate.
Which we never get anymore.
Right. When you are constantly bombarded by pre-made, hyper-optimized visual stimuli from a screen, your attention is entirely exogenous. It's pulled outward by the device. Your brain realizes, I don't need to burn calories painting a picture. This glowing rectangle is doing it for me.
And the brain is lazy, right? Or, well, efficient.
Ruthlessly efficient. So the neural pathways responsible for generating spontaneous mental imagery begin to weaken.
So when we praise modern media, like an 80-hour massive open-world video game, for being highly interactive, are we actually just misunderstanding what interactivity?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of digital design, modern interactivity is often an illusion. Chamberlain argues that interactivity in the digital age usually just means choosing from a set of pre-designed options from a menu.
Right, like branching dialogue paths.
Exactly. The developers have already imagined the entire universe, the dialogue trees, the visual aesthetic, and the outcome. Your attention is being trained into short, repetitive bursts. You are conditioned to seek quick novelty, fast feedback, and immediate dopamine.
I can hear gamers listening to this right now yelling, "Wait, I spend hours deeply invested in the lore of my favorite RPG. I am using my imagination."
And that's a completely natural defense. But look closely at where the cognitive load is actually directed when playing those games. Generally speaking, a gamer's attention isn't focused on sustaining a profound, fragile belief in the fiction of that world.
So what are they doing?
The brain power is overwhelmingly allocated to optimization. You are focused on winning, cooperating with teammates on a headset, reacting to microsecond visual stimuli, managing inventory, executing strategies.
Wow.
The fiction, like the lore, is just a highly polished, colorful wrapper for a series of mechanical reactions.
So the art is just a delivery system for a dopamine.
Precisely. People are passively consuming, and their attention is being relentlessly retained by the software. But they are appreciating the art less, and their own internal creative faculties are being engaged significantly less.
If you are listening to this right now, I want you to think about your own daily habit. When you are scrolling through a feed or playing a game on your phone, how often is your mind actually wandering?
That's a great question to ask yourself.
Right. How often are you building an original thought versus just reacting to the next flashing light, the next notification, or the next algorithmically served video? Because what Chamberlain argues is that this constant, structured, pre-packaged engagement doesn't just magically vanish when childhood ends.
No, it evolves. It metastasizes into something much more complex as we enter adolescence.
Right. And if our brains are being trained from toddlerhood to only accept familiar, prepackaged emotional templates, it makes total sense that as we become teenagers, our social development would get hijacked by the exact same machinery.
Absolutely.
Social media steps in and adds an incredibly potent layer of public performance to this already atrophied imagination.
This is where Chamberlain's analysis gets deeply sociological. Historically, adolescence is the prime developmental window for social imagination.
Social imagination, like playing pretend.
Yes, exactly. This is the era of unstructured playing, make-believe among peers, and testing out different hypothetical versions of who you might become. It's a crucial sandbox for identity.
But social media platforms have essentially paved over that sandbox.
They really have. Unstructured social imagination has been replaced by the curation of what Chamberlain calls managed semi-public self.
This completely tracks. I mean, the younger generation isn't turning to traditional fiction. The act of exploring truly made-up, fantastical worlds to figure out who they are scrolling TikTok and Instagram.
And the primary currency of those platforms isn't narrative depth or exploring the unknown.
No, the currency is hyper-specific personality traits. It's scenario. It is the absolute relentless pursuit of relatability.
That word relatability is key here. On these platforms, the highest compliment a piece of content can receive is a user in the comments saying, "That's so me."
That's so me. Wow, it's a mirror, not a window.
Exactly.
Chamberlain has this unbelievable phrase to describe this phenomenon. They say, influencer culture is a kind of collapse of fiction personality.
It's a powerful way to frame it.
Instead of creating characters, people are constructing these highly polished, semi-fictionalized versions of themselves for public consumption.
And this collapse completely rewires how an audience interacts with the narrative. Think about the traditional suspension of disbelief.
Right, like when you go to the theater.
Yes, if you sit down to read a classic novel or watch a stage play, you consciously agree to temporarily believe in a world and in characters that you know fundamentally do not exist. You lend your imagination to the author to make the experience real.
You're doing the work.
But with influencer culture, that contract is broken.
Because the audience is tracking the story arcs, the public apologies, the dramatic betrayals, and the comeback tours of people who actually do exist in the real world.
Exactly. You are anchored to a real person operating in real time, usually in a setting that looks very much like your own. Chamberlain argues that this creates a state of half-belief.
Half-belief, I like that term.
It doesn't require the heavy lifting of true imagination because you aren't suspending disbelief, you are just participating in a slightly exaggerated reality. TikTok isn't designed to transport you into a wholly other universe for 2 hours.
Right.
It is designed to play to very familiar, pre-existing social templates that are meant to be endlessly recombined.
Hold on, though. I want to look at this from the audience's perspective first. Let's say I am closely following the drama of a massive YouTube influencer for 3 years.
Okay.
I know their backstory. I understand their rivalries. I'm analyzing their apology videos. I am highly invested in an ongoing narrative. Functional. How is tracking an influencer's arc any different than tracking the serialized character arc in a Charles Dickens novel in the 1800s?
This raises an important question about the direction of your cognitive focus. The functional difference lies in projection versus anchoring.
Okay, break that down.
When you read Dickens, you must project your mind outward into the unknown. You have to stretch your imaginative capacity to understand the texture, the smell, the moral framework, and the crushing poverty of Victorian London, a context completely alien to a modern reader.
You have to build it in your head.
Yes, but influencer content does the exact opposite. It anchors you firmly to your own reality and your own ego. The influencer is sitting in a gaming chair that looks like yours, drinking an energy drink you can buy at the corner store, complaining about interpersonal drama you recognize from high school. It doesn't ask you to imagine a new world. It asks you to judge a curated version of your current one. It's the equivalent of professional wrestling.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. You know it's somewhat scripted. You know the personas are exaggerated, but you agree to treat the drama as real for the sake of entertainment. You are hovering in that state of half-belief, which requires almost zero imaginative stretching.
The wrestling analogy is perfect. It's an endless loop of familiarity. And if an entire generation's brains are being trained by these platforms to crave that frictionless, familiar loop, it makes total sense that the massive entertainment conglomerates would notice.
Oh, they definitely noticed.
Why would Hollywood spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to build a new, risky alien world when the audience's brain is literally craving the comfortable and the recognizable? Which brings us to the complete schlockification of our blockbuster culture.
This is the industrial consequence of our atrophying imagination. Chamberlain points out that our entire cultural landscape, like the multiplexes, the streaming services, the toy aisle, is currently clogged by massive intellectual property that are sustained by an incredibly tiny core of original, decades-old creativity.
Here's where it gets really because the video breaks down the actual percentages, and the math is jaw-dropping. Take Star Wars.
Let's hear it.
When you look at the totality of the Star Wars franchise today, every movie, every Disney Plus show, every comic book, every action figure, every video game, the pre-Disney era, meaning the original creative burst from George Lucas, makes up only 6% of the total volume of IP.
Think about what that implies. It means that 94% of the franchise exists strictly as derivative material.
94%. Chamberlain calls it sterile product, and it's everywhere. If you take the original Terminator film and Terminator 2, the actual visionary texts of that universe, they amount to about 9% of the total Terminator IP in existence.
Wow.
That leaves 91% as derivative, spiritless content. The original, groundbreaking Jurassic Park novel and film, that accounts for just 10% of the total Jurassic Park IP schlock now.
And a video list dozens. Halloween, Aliens, Predator, Ghostbusters. What we are witnessing is an ecosystem dominated by what Chamberlain terms a horde of pretenders and opportunists.
But why is the 94% so creatively bankrupt? I mean, what is fundamentally missing from the derivative content?
What's missing is the structural narrative risk. In traditional high-functioning fiction, whether that's a sweeping novel or the original 1977 Star Wars, the creator had to rely on a sustained narrative arc to reach a point of profound emotional or philosophical depth.
You have to earn the payoff.
Exactly. The audience had to journey through the friction of learning the rules of the world to earn that emotional payoff. But today, because audiences are primed for that instant dopamine hit of familiarity, studios just mine the surface-level aesthetics of those original 10% bursts.
Right. They take the lightsaber, the T-Rex, the proton pack.
Yes, they take that recognizable iconography and recombine them endlessly in safe, algorithmic plots.
It's the visual equivalent of an influencer saying, "That's so me." The audience points at the screen and says, "Oh, I recognize that character from my childhood." It's a hit of nostalgia substituting for the heavy lifting of true imagination.
Which is much easier to sell.
Way easier. And this opportunism isn't just restricted to recycling old Hollywood script. It is actively bleeding into the creation of brand new media, specifically through artificial intelligence. Chamberlain highlights a recent controversy in the publishing world that I think is the ultimate canary in the coal mine for this exact problem.
The shy girl.
Yeah.
If we want to understand how degraded our standards for imagination have become, this is the perfect case study.
Okay, so picture this for you listeners. A newly published horror novel called Shy Girl hits the mark. Initially, it gets an absolute avalanche of praise from readers and reviewers online.
Glowing reviews.
Right. Chamberlain actually reads some of these early reviews in the video. Readers were writing things like, "This was so much more than I was expecting. Beautiful cover and descriptive, visceral writing. I had difficulty putting this down because I kept wanting to know."
It's vital to note here that these weren't bots writing these. These were genuine readers experiencing what they believed to be a profound emotional connection to the prose. They felt the writing was visceral.
Right. But then comes the absolute whiplash. Internet sleuths start looking closer. The novel is exposed. It is canceled by the community over undeniable evidence of AI use in the text, and the author is caught red-handed stealing the cover art.
The illusion shatters completely.
Suddenly, those exact some reviewers who just days earlier praised the visceral writing rushed back to Goodreads and Amazon, edited their review, dropped them to 1 star, and completely disavowed.
This raises a deeply uncomfortable question about the mechanics of modern consumption. How is it functionally possible for human readers to be so deeply moved, so emotionally engaged by a text that was generated by a statistical algorithm predicting the next most likely word?
It's terrifying because it exposes the mechanism of our own consumption. Large language models don't have feelings. They don't have a soul. They don't have lived trauma or philosophical insight.
No, not at all.
What they do have is an unfathomably massive database of human trope, emotional trigger words, and familiar narrative structure. The AI just strung together the perfect algorithmic sequence of familiar templates. And because our imaginations are so accustomed to the frictionless, pre-packaged dopamine we talked about earlier, the readers couldn't even tell the difference.
Exactly. It reveals that we have become so conditioned to accept the shape of a story, the recognized tropes, and the expected emotional beats, that we don't even realize the human soul is missing until someone explicitly points out the code behind the curtain.
Wow.
The audience felt a sense of betrayal, not because the prose suddenly changed, but because the parasocial contract was broken.
We are desperate for a good story, but our atrophied minds are incredibly easy to trick. And frankly, human publishers are treating literature with just as much cynical algorithmic calculation as AI. Chamberlain points out the dystopian commercialization creeping into traditional publishing, where the sacred boundary of the fictional world is just obliterated for ad revenue.
The video includes these incredibly bleak, sarcastic parodies to demonstrate how commercial creep destroys immersion.
Oh, they're hilarious, but so depressed. Chamberlain imagines a scenario where blatant corporate sponsorships are just crowbarred directly into the text of a novel.
Yeah, let's hear the example.
So they read a passage that starts out sounding like standard moody fiction. A character is exhausted, winding down for the night, feeling lonely, and suddenly, mid-paragraph, the text completely pivots to, "As a gift to myself, I open a subscription to the Hallmark Channel so I can stream unlimited romances for $5.99 a month."
It violently yanks the reader out of the internal logic of the world.
And Chamberlain does it again with a classic text to show how grotesque. Imagine opening Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities and reading, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of..." But no matter what time it is, keeping contact with your loved ones is easy by simply switching to Verizon, America's fastest, most reliable network.
Unbelievable.
With unlimited talk, text, and high-speed data. I mean, it's funny because it's absurd, but it illustrates a terrifying mechanism. If you, as a culture, view art merely as a delivery mechanism for engagement and content, then there is no sacred bound. The novel just becomes another billboard.
And the moment you do that, you shatter any chance of deep, sustained imagination. You cannot lose yourself in the gritty reality of 18th century Paris or a far-off fantasy kingdom if the author hits the pause button to sell you a 5G data. The world building collapses entirely.
And that collapse of the fictional world's integrity serves as the perfect lens to examine Chamberlain's most controversial and arguably most insightful point. Because even when we aren't being sold a phone plan, modern audiences are increasingly demanding that the fictional worlds they consume reflect their own exact real-world identities back to them.
Okay, so the creator pivots here into some highly debated cultural territory regarding modern media, identity politics, and representation.
And just to set the table for you, the listener, our goal today isn't to take a side in the culture wars. We are entirely focused on analyzing the mechanics of Chamberlain's media theory regarding world building. We're looking strictly at how these trends impact the cognitive act of imagination.
That is the exact right frame. Because Chamberlain's critique isn't about the validity of any specific identity, it's about the fundamental mechanics of how an audience engages with art.
Right.
Chamberlain argues that contemporary media has undergone a massive paradigm shift. The primary goal of a piece of entertainment is no longer to present an alien, cohesive world. Instead, the primary goal is to invite the audience to locate them within the work.
Okay, locate themselves. The cultural emphasis is overwhelmingly placed on identity. Things like a character's neurodivergence, their sexual orientation, their specific cultural background, or their trauma. The content is explicitly designed and marketed to serve as a proxy for the viewer's own lived experience.
Yes. Chamberlain contrasts this deeply inward focus with what they call world-centered imagery. The classic touchstone here is J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth.
A great example.
Historically, the internal integrity of the fictional work was paramount. You did not open The Lord of the Rings because you believed Middle-earth was an accurate demographic reflection of your personal life in the suburbs. You entered it precisely because it was not you.
Right. It was a coherent, compelling, entirely separate environment that operated strictly on its own historical, magical, and moral terms.
The imaginative act was an outward projection. It functioned as a window. The audience looks through the window and asks, what is this strange new world? How do I understand it?
But today, Chamberlain argues, we have downgraded that experience into what they call self-centered immersion. Now, fiction is shaped like a mirror, so that the very first question the audience asks when they look at it is, where am I in this?
And this structural shift completely changes the design of a protagonist. In the mirror framework, protagonists are frequently constructed merely as vessels for identity. Their defining traits are often heavily linked to specific modern traumas or outsider status, and their narrative arcs are less about exploring an unknown frontier or wrestling with grand philosophical questions, and much more about achieving recognition, validation, and empowerment within the story.
Chamberlain argues this prioritizes the comfort of recognition over the hard work, which connects directly back to the critique of how Hollywood handles those massive, stale, 94% derivative IP.
It's all connected.
The video points out the modern studio marketing tactic of proudly touting representational milestones in franchise media. For example, the press tours where an actor is celebrated for being the first Puerto Rican elf in the Rings of Power, or another actor highlighting their groundbreaking role as the first gay Klingon Starfleet Academy.
According to the mechanics of Chamberlain's argument, the problem is not the inclusion of those identities. The structural problem is that these modern milestones are being grafted onto source material that is in its 100th iteration, suffering from incredibly weak, derivative, algorithm-driven storytelling.
So they're just dropping new things into old molds.
Yes. The author's perspective is that while this progressivism provides a superficial sheen of freshness, there is absolutely nothing inherently imaginative about taking a decades-old franchise template and simply dropping a modern identity milestone into it.
Hold on, though. I want to push back and look at this from the perspective of the audience member. If someone has historically never seen themselves included in these grand, epic cultural narratives, if they've always been sidelined, isn't the act of finally seeing themselves as an elf or a starship captain a deeply imaginative and transformative experience for them?
That's a really valid perspective.
Why does Chamberlain view this specifically as a downgrade in our collective cultural imagination?
It's a vital question. To understand Chamberlain's stance, you have to look at what they believe constitutes high-functioning fiction. Chamberlain argues that true, powerful fiction derives its world-altering capability from forcing the reader or viewer to encounter what they call an alien moral system.
An alien moral, meaning a psychology or a societal structure that does not map onto your 21st century values.
Precisely. When you encounter a truly alien world, say, the rigid, brutal feudalism of Frank Herbert's Dune universe, you have to do the heavy cognitive work of adjusting your mind to understand it.
Right, you don't just step into it effortlessly.
No, you do not immediately recognize yourself or your modern political values in the Atreides or the Harkonnen. Chamberlain believes that prioritizing modern representation milestones within stale, recycled IP acts as a cheap substitute for the incredibly difficult task of genuine, original world building.
Because it's too easy.
In a way, it traps the viewer in their own reality, constantly looking in that mirror for validation rather than transporting them through a window into a truly new, challenging paradigm that might actually expand their mind.
That makes total sense when you introduce Chamberlain's concept of meta. This is the idea that when your experience of a fantasy show partially anchored in the fictional lore, but heavily anchored in your real-world identity and the cultural milestones being marketed by the studio, you can never actually sink into.
Right. You are constantly experiencing meta-awareness. You are watching Puerto Rican elf or the gay Klingon, but your brain is simultaneously actively aware of the representational milestone in the real world. You are aware of the toxic Twitter discourse surrounding the cast. You are aware of your own political or cultural position relative to that discourse.
You're intermittently stepping entirely outside the fiction to register what it means culturally in the real world. You are literally pausing the fantasy to check your reality.
And Chamberlain uses this exact mechanism of meta-awareness and identity bind to explain a very specific, very modern phenomenon: the intense, often incredibly toxic online fandom defenses.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
Why do certain segments of fans get so fiercely, almost violently, involved in defending heavily flawed shows from even basic narrative criticism?
Because If the show's primary marketing mechanism is that it serves as a proxy for your real-world identity, then the corporate product and your personal affirmation become biologically bound together.
Exactly.
If a critic goes online and says, the pacing in episode 3 of this show is terrible and the dialogue is clunky, the viewer doesn't process that as a critique of a television. Because their identity is bound to the character, they process the critique as a deep personal threat to their own existence.
It creates an environment where objective artistic critique becomes impossible, and the imagination is entirely subjugated by the ego.
Okay, so if we follow this logic to its conclusion, that modern writers, modern marketing department, modern audience are entirely focused inward on identity, real-world trauma, and the self, what exactly did the older generations of writers have that we don't?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. If we have lost the window, who are the people building?
This brings us to the final and perhaps most melancholic section of Chamberlain's essay, the passing of what they consider the lost generation of world builders. Chamberlain argues that a major factor in the death of imagination is the literal dying off of highly educated older figures who possessed a very specific, incredibly broad set of historical and philosophical experience.
The video lists the absolute titans of genre fiction: J.R.R. Tolkien, Frank Herbert, Philip K. Dick, C.S. Lewis. And the crucial point here is that these writers didn't just sit in a room and invent magic systems or cool spaceships for the sake of engagement.
Not at all.
They took massive, complex, external concepts, ideology, theology, philosophy, theories of power, and often their own harrowing lived experiences of global war, and embedded them deep into the bedrock.
Think about the mechanism of how Tolkien built Middle-earth. Tolkien didn't just create languages. He took his first-hand visceral experience of the absolute mechanized horrors of the First World War, the mud, the slaughter, the destruction of the natural landscape by industry, and he combined it with deep Catholic theology regarding the corrupting, addictive nature of power.
He lived through unimaginable.
He did. And he embedded those massive external pressures into the physical landscape of Mordor and the concept of the One Ring.
He built an alien moral system.
Exactly. Or look at Frank Herbert. Herbert was a journalist who studied the ecology of the Oregon Dune. He embedded incredibly dense ideas about environmental scarcity, geopolitical power dynamics, the danger of charismatic leaders, and the manipulation of religion into Dune.
And Philip K. Dick?
Philip K. Dick wrestled with unsettling metaphysical visions of technology, surveillance, and the subjective nature of reality itself. C.S. Lewis wove deep systemic theological allegories into Narnia.
The key phrase Chamberlain uses here is that ideas were embedded in its stealth. A 12-year-old might pick up Dune or The Lord of the Rings purely for the surface-level adventure, the sandworms or the sword fight. But while they are reading, they are subconsciously absorbing and adapt grand deepings of thought.
The fiction is doing double duty.
Yeah. And Chamberlain notes that this didn't just stop in the mid-20th century. Even slightly more contemporary works, man. Look at J.K. Rowling and the Harry Potter. Even operating as a children's fantasy, that world forces young readers to actively contend with massive external societal.
That's a really good point.
Right. You read about the Ministry of Magic, and as a kid, you are getting a masterclass in bureaucratic overreach and governmental incompetence. You meet Dolores Umbridge, and you are encountering the banality of evil, petty authoritarianism, and institutional cowardice. It's highly pleasurable on the surface, but it is packed with ideas that extend far beyond the protagonist's internal.
But Chamberlain argues that the cultural pipeline that produced those kinds of systemic thinkers has severely narrowed. Today's prominent writers are far less likely to come through rigorous classical, historical, or theological educational backgrounds.
That makes sense.
And thankfully, they're far less likely to have had direct encounters with large-scale historical trauma, like fighting in the trenches of a world war.
Sure, we wouldn't wish that on anyone. But the result of that piece, according to the video, is that cultural prestige has moved entirely away from grand systems of thought. The big, sweeping questions of the 20th century: what is the nature of power? What constitutes true evil? What is the inevitable fate of human civilization? Have been replaced.
Replaced by what?
Chamberlain states this perfectly. Too many writers, editors, and magazine contributors like to imagine identity as zeitgeist, and then they drop the hammer. Identity isn't zeitgeist.
Oof, that's a heavy line. If we look at the broader picture of literary history, Chamberlain notes that even the recent contemporary greats writers who didn't necessarily write fantasy, like Salman Rushdie, Ian McEwan, Martin Amis, and Kazuo Ishiguro, worked brilliantly at the intersection of philosophy, political history, science, and profound moral ambiguity.
They use Ishiguro's novel Never Let Me Go as the ultimate contrast to modern trauma might. If you haven't read it, it is a profoundly devastating, emotional book about clones.
It's incredible.
But Chamberlain points out that it's not just about the characters feeling sad about their fate. It is fundamentally a book about bioethics. It is an exploration of the instrumentalization of human life, class structure, and the absolute horrors of a quiet, polite, bureaucratic totalitarian.
The world building is doing the heavy lifting.
Yes. The emotional devastation of that book only lands so perfectly because the external conceptual societal world building is so stark, rigid, and...
This is the ultimate clarifying contrast Chamberlain is drawing between the eras. With great older work, the pressure that drives the narrative comes from outside the self. The characters are squeezed by history, by metaphysics, by massive political systems, or by terrifying technological change.
But in contemporary work...
In so much of contemporary work, the pressure comes entirely from inside the self. The conflicts are purely driven by internal trauma, subjective emotional states, and insular relational dynamics.
So what does this actually mean for you, the listener? If our broader culture is actively shifting away from building external worlds and moving aggressively toward mining internal trauma, how do we as consumers navigate that?
It requires an active, conscious audit of our own media diet. Chamberlain is challenging us to look closely at our consumption. Think back to the last 5 books you read or the last 5 television shows you binged.
Good exercise.
Where did the central friction come from? Was the protagonist struggling against a grand external system that challenged your understanding of how a society could operate? Or was the conflict derived purely from the protagonist's internal emotional state and their journey toward personal validation?
Wow.
Chamberlain warns that a culture that overwhelmingly privileges interiority at the expense of external conceptual framework risks producing an entire generation of fiction that is emotionally vivid, perhaps, but intellectually, philosophically, and imaginatively underpowered.
It is a profound, incredibly vital warning. We've covered massive ground dive. We started by looking at the sheer neurological mechanics of the moderns, how pre-made high-definition stimulation acts as a motorized wheelchair for the brain, suppressing the default mode network and atrophying our biological ability to generate spontaneous mental images.
We tracked how that early conditioning evolves into influencer culture, where the social imaginations are replaced by curated public selves, collapsing fiction into personality and trapping audiences in a frictionless loop of half-belief.
We examine the industrial reality of Hollywood's IP schlock, where 94% of our blockbuster culture is derivative product propped up by a tiny 6% core of original, decades-old.
And we saw how that algorithmic approach to storytelling opens the door for synthetic AI art to easily trick our weakened imagination, and how commercial creep turns novels into billboards.
We navigated the complex structural shift from world-centered imagination to self-centered immersion, exploring how substituting identity milestones for true world-building traps audiences in a mirror rather than transporting.
And finally, we mourned the narrowing pipeline of writers, the loss of the titans who had the historical and philosophical breadth to build grand systems of thought and embed them seamlessly into compelling alien worlds.
Now, it is important to acknowledge a caveat that Chamberlain themselves in the video. Whenever you make a macro-cultural critique this broad, people will always offer up anecdotal evidence to the contrary.
All right, Chamberlain actually jokes about the inevitable commenter saying, but my nephew just bought the entire 14-book series of Demon Conqueror Wolfbane and The Restorer of the Three Kingdoms, and he's reading them every night.
Exact. There are always kids reading deep, dense fantasy. The imagination isn't dead in every single individual, but Chamberlain is strictly addressing the macro-cultural trend. The dominant current of the digital age is flowing rapidly away from the difficult, elevated experience of truly imagining a novel world.
Yes, the macro trend is undeniable.
And to drive this entire thesis home, Chamberlain closes the essay with 2 incredibly potent quotes from literature. I want to share them with you to frame how we should think about art.
The first is from the brilliant modernist Virginia Woolf. She's giving advice on how a reader should approach Edmund Spenser's massive, complex 16th century epic poem, The Faerie Queene.
Woolf says that the first, most essential rule is not put it off as long as possible. She says you must first grind out politics, absorb science, wallow in fiction, walk about London, observe the crowd, calculate the loss of life and limb, rub shoulders with the poor in market, buy and sell. She argues you must fix your mind firmly on the financial columns of the newspapers, on the weather, on the crop. You must actively detest allegory and adore the robust, harsh, plain-spoken, real world.
And then only after you have fully immersed yourself in the grit, the friction and the complex reality of the external world. Wolf says, when the whole being is red and brittle as sandstone in the sun, make a dash for the ferry, give yourself...
It's an incredible philosophy. You have to understand the systems of the real world deeply before you have the capacity to truly surrender fictional.
It really reframes what it means to read fantasy.
And then, for a much more blunt, modern assessment, the video turns to the English poet Philip Larkin. Larkin argues fiercely that literature shouldn't be a soothing vehicle designed to pamper your... His quote is simply, "Poetry is nobody's business except the poets, and everybody else can F off."
Yeah.
It is a stark, almost violent contrast to the modern demand that every piece of art must intimately relate to and validate the viewer. Which brings us to a final, crucial synthesis of everything Chamberlain has argued.
Right. Leave us with something to chew on. Where does this leave us in the real world?
If our cognitive muscles for imagination have truly been outsourced to screens and algorithmic dopamine loops, and if our grand fictions have been reduced to nothing more than a mirror reflecting our own specific modern identities back at us, what happens to our ability to envision a future in the real world?
Oh, well.
If we lose the capacity to imagine a truly alien, uncomfortable, unfamiliar fictional world, how can we possibly imagine a real-world society that is fundamentally different and better than the deeply flawed one we live in? If you literally cannot imagine the Shire, you cannot imagine a better Earth. The damage to the imagination is entirely invisible. There is no physical scan that can show us the exact moment our minds stop reaching outward and start only looking inward.
Just slow.
But the consequences are a collective inability to dream of systems, structures, and futures beyond our own immediate reflection are playing out everywhere around us. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take a moment today to look at your screens, the algorithms that feed them, and the stories you consume just a little differently.